Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for listening to another Star Wars podcast. Today, we're bringing you an interview with Kevin Yost, senior editor at Lucasfilm. Kevin's been doing trailers for the Star Wars animated series, dating all the way back to when the Clone Wars first aired on Cartoon Network. In this interview, we talked to Kevin about past Star Wars trailers he's worked on, the process to make these trailers, using the Bad Batch Season 2 trailer as an example, and his journey and career leading to Lucasfilm. He also shared his advice for someone looking into becoming a professional trailer editor, which was really cool. Matt and I had a great time talking to Kevin. It was really cool to kind of get into his head and how he approaches creating a new trailer from start to finish. I personally had no idea the amount of work that goes into this process, especially seeing how it's transformed from the 80s up until now. Some of the stuff Kevin was telling us about is wild. So I hope you guys enjoy that because I learned a whole lot from this conversation and I did not know it was as meticulous as it used to be. We are so grateful to Kevin and the fact that he said yes to this interview. We'd also like to give a very big thank you and shout out to Tracy Cannobbio for arranging this interview and being very gracious with her time as well. Without her, it wouldn't have happened, and Matt and I are extremely grateful for this opportunity to speak with Kevin. So with that being said, we hope you guys enjoy this conversation, hope you learn something, and as always, may the Force be with you, and we will see you soon. So first of all, Kevin, welcome to the show. We are so excited to have you here. We understand that your schedule is very busy, so thank you for taking time out of your day to speak with us, and we're just so excited to have you here.
Great, thanks for having me.
Kevin, thanks for joining. Let's first do a little intro too on Kevin.
Yeah.
Just in case anyone doesn't know, in case any of our listeners aren't familiar, we have Kevin Yost, who's a senior editor at Lucasfilm on the show today. So super fortunate to have him join us. Really, really appreciative of you taking the time.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
So, Kevin, why don't we start at the very beginning? It's with your origin story. So, where are you from originally? What inspired you to pursue trailer editing? And kind of like, how did you get to where you are now with Lucasfilm? Loaded question.
Yeah, well, back me up if I skip over anything. Was from Northern California, specifically the Bay Area. I actually, when I grew up watching Star Wars, it was always fascinating to me. But I was on a path to go and be a biologist. I went to school thinking I was going to be a herpetologist, which is someone that studies reptiles and amphibians, and that's where my mind was. And long story short, I sort of deviated from that path, and I found film, and I really enjoyed film. And after college, I eventually made my way to Southern California. And really, the most significant job that I had initially was at a trailer house. And a trailer house is basically marketing for movies, whether it's theatrical or home video. And there was no streaming service at that point. And I was a production assistant there. And I had done some editing in college and in some of to backtrack a bit, in college, I deviated from being a biology major to being a visual arts major with a film emphasis. And so film criticism classes, production classes, all that kind of stuff. And then when I got to the trailer house, that was really sort of my baptism of jumping right in and seeing what's going on editorially. And I thought, man, that's really cool. I'd really like to try and do that. So I was what they called a runner or a production assistant, and you do anything from picking up the owner's kids from school and taking them home to delivering Christmas gifts to clients, to working on whatever project is going on that a trailer house would do at that time. And so I sort of let it be known that I was really interested in doing that. And some of the other folks that were working with me were either they were part-time workers, kids on a summer job, or some of them were actors and they were just working this job in between acting jobs. And I just sort of let it be known that, hey, I like editing. I'd like to try editing. And then sort of they gave me more things to do. And eventually they just pulled me off of being a production assistant and assigned me to an editor. And that's kind of, from there you go to become an apprentice editor. And then I was a full-fledged sound editor. And then I moved my way into doing picture editing on trailers. And then you kind of, as a career goes, you leave that place, you go to another place, and then you kind of take those steps up and things like that. And that's sort of how that happened. How I ended up at Lucasfilm in particular, to backtrack a bit, my wife was working at Disney TV Animation, and Dave Filoni, Henry Gilroy, and Catherine Winder, who were sort of the three main people on the early Clone Wars, they had both worked with my wife at various points, or all three had worked with my wife at various points. And when they were trying to figure out how to staff up the Clone Wars team up here in Northern California, all three of them sort of thought of my wife. And so that's how we moved from Southern California back up to Northern California. She was working there. I was working freelance stuff here at home. And then, as luck would have it, my reel landed on the right person's desk at Lucasfilm. I went in for an interview and kind of got hired on the spot. So
wow,
that's pretty cool. And so the 11, 12-year-old kid in me was freaking out. Whereas when you're in the interview, you're just you're like, okay, yeah, that's okay. All right. I can start next week.
I'm totally professional.
And you get in the car, you're like, you know, yeah, so that's kind of it. And working at Lucasfilm, which the department I am working in is called Lucas Video Production, and we handle anything from outward facing content to inward only facing content, and that could be stuff for licensing or PR or marketing, or games at that time, for interior eyes only, and outward facing stuff, which would be trailers or behind the scenes stuff, stuff that would go online, stuff that would be added value material for, at that point, DVDs or convention stuff, show stuff, that kind of thing. So
super cool. Wow. I'm curious, like when you first got started, because you said you were interested in it and you were just like, hey, that's something I kind of want to do. Was that something that you had thought about like when you were a kid at all? Or like, did you have like an editing software that you had started tinkering around with where you're like, hey, this is something I could do? Or like, how did that really happen?
When I was younger, my older sister and her friends would make Super 8 movies, and I would always sort of want to be involved in that. And then it never really sort of became a reality until college. And when I was in college, my sister, who's older than me, she was working in marketing in theatrical advertising. So I had sort of an individual that I knew was working in the film industry. So I thought, okay, that's a real thing. I can actually get a job doing that. But in terms of editing, I sort of enjoyed editing in college, but there was no editing software. And, you know, I'm dating myself. It was 60mm film or 3/4 inch tape.
Wow.
And I don't know if anyone has ever edited on 3/4 inch tape. You know, you put it in the deck and you have 2 or 3 decks of source material, and then one deck that's a recorder, and you toggle with the knobs or the joystick, and you find the scene, you mark it in, go to your out, you mark it out, and then the decks rewind, they get in sync and they roll, and then when it gets to the point, the record starts and records it and then stops.
Wow.
So yeah, it's completely archaic compared to what we can do now. Now it's, I recorded something on a file or on my iPhone or whatever. You ingest it into whatever software you're using, and the files, it's there. And
yeah,
then,
so that's crazy. The fact that you have lived through this crazy technological advancement.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, even in our lifetime, I think it's crazy to see the technological advancement, but you've even seen more than that. So was that like a gradual process, you getting used to, I guess, the new types of softwares and all the bells and whistles that they have today? Or was it something that you like, you know, had to kind of learn more on the spot? Like it was tougher to do, or was it just like more of just an easy gradual type of thing?
I think it was a little bit of both. If I can jump forward to working at the trailer house, at that point, editors were still cutting TV spots and trailers on film, and some were working on video. And when things would go, when a picture gets locked, whether it was for a trailer or a TV spot, you had to cut. Let me back up. Let me see. So if an editor is cutting on video, at that point, a video had the one video channel and the 2 audio channels. So whether or not they're cutting sound effects, dialogue, or music or narration, in the 90s, there was a lot of narration used on TV spots and trailers.
Yeah.
The editor had to be economical with what they were doing. So editing wasn't super sophisticated in terms of how things were constructed or put together or sound design. I mean, the ideas were there, but you were kind of limited with that. So the editor would have a locked picture of a trailer, and if it was cut on tape, we'd go through a process of getting that tape turned into film, because ultimately at that point we always had to put something onto film because it was going to be projected. There was no digital projection at that point. It was a baby in George Lucas's mind at that point, and no one really knew anything about it. So you get it onto film, you go to the editorial department, you pull all those bits of film, and as an assistant editor or a sound editor, the finishing department, we put that together. So we would reassemble this video trailer in film form, and then we would take that, and then we would have to cut audio for it on film, because ultimately we would go to the sound stage with boxes of these rolls of film. They'd probably be about this big. This is probably about a 2-minute trailer. It was about that big on 35mm film. So you would have your picture, you would have your narration and your dialogue, and then your music and effects. Now, dialogue. So please stop me if I'm boring you to tears.
No. It's just like amazing.
So if I was cutting the dialogue, we would do sort of what's called A and B dialogue. So you wouldn't want to have 2 individuals talking on the same film strip. You wouldn't want to have this line of dialogue from one person right next to another person, or within a couple feet, right? Because we're sort of dealing with feet because it's film.
Yeah.
So you would basically put Melissa's dialogue would be here, and then Matt's dialogue would be here. And so you would sort of get it one roll was A side, one roll was B side of the dialogue. So you would sort of A, B the dialogue. And depending on how complicated the scene is, maybe you had 3 rolls of film. So that's for dialogue. And then for narration, typically it was just one. If you had narration, it was just one film track of narration. And then if you had music, depending on how many crossfades there were, or changes of music or upcutting of music, right? Matt, you're familiar with, if you want to cut out a moment of music and you want to upcut it.
Yeah.
Typically you wouldn't do a hard cut, because you would sort of want to give a little bit of overlap, and the mixer would sort of do a nice little crossfade.
Right.
So I could have 6 tracks of music, 6 rolls of music, and then sound effects. And sound effects could be 12 rolls. It could be 30 rolls or 40 rolls of just sound effects. Back then, it was if you were doing an action movie and there was a lot of gunfire or explosions or car chases, you would go and you'd listen to this library, and you go to the sound department, and on the CD or the DAT, everyone know what a DAT is? Digital audio tape.
Yeah.
It's okay. So it's a little 8mm videotape, essentially, that had, I think, maybe 10 tracks that you could put audio on it. And that was sort of the early digital device. So you would go through and you'd listen to these tracks and go tell the sound room, I need 13 of track 12. I need 2 minutes of track 72, which is background jungle music, jungle sounds, right?
Wow.
You would do this. So I would come in with all of these rolls of film, and then I'd load up. I go, okay, I'm gonna do gunshots, and you go through and it's on a flatbed. If you know what, you load it onto a flatbed. Maybe you can pull up a graphic of a moviola flatbed. You would have the picture, and then you would have the guide track, essentially, and then the track in front of me, I would put the gunshots on, and I would just roll through, and I'd find a gunshot that I liked, and I'd just park it there, and then I'd roll down and find a gunshot in the trailer or the TV spot, and then I'd mark it up, cut it out, and then you hang it in a bin. Matt, I don't know if you've used Avid, but
yeah,
they had the folders that you have your content in the Avid Media Composer Editing project. They're called bins, and that's just a layover from film.
Yeah.
Oftentimes now, I guess they're called just folders. And so you would have this bin, and they had these little pins on that you would take the little sprocket hole and hang it on the pin, and you'd have this bin full of sound effects. And then I'd go through and load up a dummy reel, which was a 2-minute reel of nothing, of blank film. And you put it into a sync block and you run it through. And you knew when I was cutting the gunshots, let's say, I knew that this gunshot was at 35 feet, 6 frames, because you have the counter on the moviola. And then when I would crank through on the sync block, you go, there's 35 feet, 6 frames, pull it back, cut it, drop that in, and go to the next one. And then you have a cue sheet. It was this huge piece of paper that had just rows, and you would have track 1, track 2, track 3, and you would go through that.
Wow.
And it was labor intensive, but it was a lot of fun going to the sound stage. And it was typically the size of a movie theater or a small movie theater. And the good guys that were mixing would mix, they'd play it forward and they would mix. And then and you couldn't just jump back. You had to rewind the film, right? These guys would also mix in reverse. It just blew well, the first time I found out he was going in reverse, and he was adjusting the faders. And I said, "Hey, what you doing?" He's like, "Oh, I'm mixing reverse too."
What?
What? And I think he's just listening for sound levels. He's not necessarily trying to get the consonant of a word to sort of cut through or anything like that.
Yeah, you're scrubbing it, and you can hear
it was all you could. If you had the volume up, you could hear it. Yeah,
that's nuts. So that must be crazy for you to start out doing that. And then now we have all these sophisticated programs and software, and you can load up like the sound effects with like what you're talking about.
Yeah,
you can just pull them up in a folder now and just go through the different gunshot sound effects, and you can organize them by folder of like how you want to insert them in there. So, like, how far we've come from then to now, where it's so much more plug and play. Where you're able to mix and match things a lot more efficiently, and you can experiment a lot more because it's not as labor intensive, right?
Right. Well, in a way, yes, it's not as labor intensive, but also the demands are higher and the expectations are higher. So the creative process is still the creative process, and the angst or the worry or the exuberance that comes from that process is still there. And however, everyone sort of has their own sort of bell curve of how things are done, right?
Yeah.
So that's still there.
So that's interesting. Let's get into that for a second. Like, in terms of creative process, what does yours look like? How do you approach a project?
So even like, if we can backtrack for 1 second before we even get into that. So just so people know, it's like, can you give us examples of projects that you have worked on, for example? I can already think of 2 right now, but how would people know your work?
Well, I pretty much, for Lucasfilm, I pretty much did all of the Clone Wars trailers except for 2. And that was the very first one that Dave showed at Comic-Con way back. And it was sort of in a side room at Comic-Con. Was it Comic-Con, or I'm pretty sure it was Comic-Con, or it was in LA. It was one of the cons there.
Yeah,
one of the 30 million cons.
Well, right. I'm trying to remember, because I think it was at the LA Convention Center. I think maybe it was San Diego. I don't quite remember. And then with the most recent issue of Clone Wars, I did the Celebration Chicago trailer, and then the one that came out later, closer to the release of the show, that was done by the folks down at Disney.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but you did do the Bad Batch season 2 trailer, didn't you?
Yes.
Okay. Because Matt and I, when we were doing a podcast episode, I did want to mention this to you. When we were doing a podcast episode, that trailer dropped. And I was like, Matt, stop. We have to watch this right now. And so we did like a live reaction on the show.
Oh, cool.
And I will just say, I love that trailer, but the music for that trailer gets me so hyped up. It's like you get to the end and you're like, oh my God, like, yes, let's go, season 2.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, especially the ending, like the way the music kind of comes in at the end. I just think the pacing of that particular trailer, and it's interesting to me, which is why I kind of want to get in like the creative process for you, because there's a couple different styles of editors that you can kind of pick out in terms of how they approach a certain film or television show or whatever. But with the Bad Batch, specifically Bad Batch season 2, it's like one of those trailers that you watch, it doesn't give too much away, and by the end of it, you're just like stoked. You want to watch the show immediately.
Well, cool. That was the hope that
Yeah.
we wanted to do. So yeah.
Well, so let's get into that then. Like,
why don't we we
Bad
could
Batch-
use Bad Batch as an example.
Yeah. So like,
Like-
what's your creative process like? Like, how do you dive into that? What does that look like? You know, from start to finish, like what happens and how do you get into that?
Giving you some big questions.
Right. And I don't want to sit there and go, Essentially, it starts with a meeting, and you meet with the stakeholders, and the stakeholders could be marketing folks or the PR folks or the filmmakers, whoever that may be. And you meet with the stakeholders, and they sort of talk to you and they sort of lay out what their idea is, or maybe what the piece is going to be used for. And you sort of get a lay of the land of how it's going to be used and what they're looking for. And you're kind of off to the races. They may give you specifically to the Bad Batch, there was only a couple things they said, don't go here, don't show this, or don't do that. And that happens. And sometimes you don't get that at all. They just said, just do something, and then we'll pull back what we don't want. But for this case, they gave me a couple things they didn't want to show. And then I just kind of just went to town on it. And you get the episodes, you get whatever is finished at that point in time. The whole season wasn't done, so you only get a few episodes, or maybe 6 or 8 episodes out of the whole season. Like we talked earlier, maybe a couple of them aren't finished 100%. So you kind of have to pick and choose. Maybe I'll use this scene from here, and we'll try and get this scene. And sometimes the really complicated shots, you just know they're never going to be done in time, so you don't even go there. So I'll watch the shows, and then I'll pull selects, and I'll break down my selects, and I'll organize my selects. I'll have a big bin of dialogue for all the characters, and then I'll have a bin of just visuals, and I'll sort of categorize the visuals. And every editor sort of categorizes those things very differently and how they work. And I'll sort of do that. So I have essentially 2 bins or 2 folders of content from the shows. And then once I do that, then I start a music search. And music searching could take a couple hours. It could take a few days, because you're trying to find something that's kind of original, and that sounds like it fits in that world, but doesn't. You don't want to have something that reminds you of Peter Pan or the movie Hook or Transformers, right? You want something that sort of like in your mind can live in that world. So as I'm looking for that music in various libraries that we have, I've also talked with the music team that I was working with in Burbank at the Disney team, and I've told them sort of what I'm looking for. So they have a team of people that will go and look for stuff. So they'll at one point give me a big folder of music, and then I have my folder of music, and it could be 20 cues long, it could be 80 cues deep. And once I get that, I sort of listen to it again and kind of pull out sections that I like. And then I'll start cutting, and I'll try to start thinking about how I want to start it and open it, and lay down some music, and I'll start cutting to that, and maybe play around with sound effects and sort of try and create a mood. And I could be 2 days into that, and I'm like, I don't like the music anymore. So I'll switch out the music and put something else in. And all of a sudden, hey, it clicks. This really works. And I'll sort of go with that. So there's a trial and error process. Sometimes editors, will find something, we'll put it down. We immediately know that's it. And other times you try something and you kind of work with it for a time being, and it just doesn't quite feel it. And you pull something out and you try something new, and then it works. For that in particular piece, I think we started with one bit of music at the very beginning, which was sort of the flashback bit. And then, believe it or not, once we sort of get into the sort of the current season 2 footage, it's all the same cue. I don't change cues, and it has very different feelings, especially at the very end. It's very different. But what I was using was, and this sort of will roll back to the sophistication of editing that you touched on earlier. In film, you had sort of this track and these other tracks, and you would sort of crossfade it on 2 different rolls of film, and maybe there's 6 tracks of stereo audio, and you're trying to construct this trailer. As digital editing and the Avid and the Avid Media Composer program and Final Cut and Premiere sort of eventually came on board, you have multiple tracks of audio. Early days of Avid Media Composer, there were 4 tracks of audio. You had more than 2, but you only had 4. So there was still the mono dialogue, the mono narration, the mono effects, and the mono music. So when we would finish stuff, we would still have to go back and recreate that on film in stereo, and then plus it out with sound effects and sound design. Eventually, the Avid got 8 tracks of audio, so editors were able to do a little bit more. Nowadays, I think I can have 36 to 38 tracks actively playing, but I can have unlimited tracks built. So an editor now can really have a huge amount of music and sound design going on. So with that cue for the Bad Batch, I had the stereo cue, which I really liked, but I was able to get what's called the stems. And you familiar when if I say stems for the music?
Yeah.
Okay.
You get like the bass. So for everyone who doesn't know, that's like you get the bass separated out from the drums, separated out from guitar and vocals, and so you can kind of cut them together the way you'd like to cut them together. So when someone hears a trailer and it's just the instrumental, or let's say it's an epic start with just the vocal with a piano under it, like that's how the editors do it. Is you take the stems. You
start to think in terms of, I really like this, and I like the beginning, but I don't like the percussion that comes in. So with the stems, I can just play that piano, that soft piano, or maybe the soft vocal, and then when there's sort of a mood change or an act change, I can bring these other things in. So in the body of the trailer, I mostly just dropped that hip hop beat. I pulled that out, and then I emphasized various elements of that cue, and then when I got to the end, I cut that in, and then we sort of had that drop in the music. You didn't really hear anything, and then we kind of hit hard with that music going to the end. In a simple form, explained lengthily, that's kind of how it is. And that's how pretty much most of the music editing is being done on trailers and theatrical marketing, that the editors are really able to get their fingers into these things with the stems and sort of pull things out and sort of customize elements. And it really works well if you have something that's really hard hitting, and then you want to have some dialogue, the act of the trailer sort of pulls back, and maybe there's a little bit of story development. You can just drop those things out, and then you just sort of have the underscore playing, and then you can go back to the main score.
So you are really responsible for setting the tone and the hype of these shows. I mean, if we're really thinking about it, like if you're sitting behind the screen, like you are the person creating that anticipation and the hype for what's to come. And the best example I can think of for this is the season 2 Rebels trailer, with that overlay where you guys introduced that Captain Rex was coming to Rebels with the whole "My name is Rex, Captain."
Right.
And that, I remember I wasn't at that celebration, but I was watching it on the live stream.
Okay.
And I remember hearing that, just being like, "Oh my God, it's Captain Rex! I can't believe he's coming!" And then there's the voiceover of Hondo. And then he comes in on that shot, and I was like, "Oh my God, it's Hondo!" And so it's like, in that really cool way, you are setting the expectations and the hype for the next season or for a new show. So that is really cool.
Yeah, well, thanks. That's the hope, and that's what we're trying to do is get people excited, and maybe people that don't know too much about the show, get them excited.
Yeah. Well, how does that feel? Like, have you ever watched those, or like you watched I'm sure you've probably seen some reaction videos of people doing reactions to your trailers. Like, what is that weird to like see your work on there and then have people have these like really emotional reactions to something that you've done?
Yes and no, but I will say that it's really enjoyable. I mean, being an editor, we're not out front, we're behind the scenes, and to see people enjoy what we do, that's great. That's awesome. And to have people drawn to tears or cheering or anything like that. That's icing on the cake. And that a lot of times is really sort of invigorating, to see people get so hyped about something that you've worked so hard on, and that they're excited about it and excited about the show you're trying to help promote. That's really sort of, you get, like I said, you get invigorated, you get sort of your batteries recharged.
Yeah.
And especially to be in the room when it happens. Like Melissa, I was in sort of in the back area of in Anaheim when that season trailer launched. And I can remember, I know the trailer by heart, but I can remember sort of sitting there and everything tightened in my body, because you're like, how are people going to react? How are people going to react?
Right.
And so when people cheered, that was okay. I can relax a little bit. It's working, especially because my wife is a huge Captain Rex fan. She worked on Clone Wars, and she always points out to me, I'm the original Captain Rex fan, and he was in that, and I just had to keep my mouth shut for weeks on end. I couldn't tell her anything, so we went, and she's sitting a couple people down. It was her and my son and my daughter next to me, and then we're sitting there, and I was sitting with a bunch of coworkers, and when that happened, I could just hear out of the corner of my ear that she was cheering, and my daughter was hitting my leg, like she was just pounding my leg. So that was pretty cool.
That's like a top 10 Star Wars like moments. Like, because you get so overwhelmed with these moments and these characters that come back that mean so much to people. And I just remember the way I felt. I watched the trailer, and then I got on the phone with my best friend, and I was like, did you see the trailer they put back? Oh my God, it's season 2. I can't believe it's so great. And so it's just like knowing that you have the power to give people that feeling, I think is just such a cool gift. And that would make me really proud. So, I mean, like, kudos.
Well, thanks. But I will say, I have to give full acknowledgement to the team, the animation teams that do this stuff. And if it wasn't for the amazing work that they do top to bottom in terms of creating the stories and directing and creating the look and running the whole show and everything, they're giving us such cool stuff to work with. So it's definitely a team effort, I think, in terms of that, because they're creating this really great content that even as a fan, I'm excited to see. So I just sort of try to feel, as a fan, what would mixed with a trailer editor, what would I want to see, and what would I want to try and do. And to be honest, sometimes there's a little bit of shorthand involved. You're trying to compress big long moments into sort of 2 exchanges of dialogue, or maybe even just an exchange of a look. Sort of to send the same message visually. So there's some shorthand, there's a little bit of, smoke and mirrors sometimes involved, but I think the overall tone of what we're trying to say gets across.
That's such an interesting component of it to me too, is because you're totally right. Like, obviously there's a lot of people involved in this, but from your perspective, you're looking at, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but you're looking at so many different elements when you're watching this stuff for the first time. When they give you all this content, you're looking at it, you have to look at the different dialogue, the music cues, the acting in it, like the looks that people are giving one another. And like, that must be a difficult thing to kind of pick out. I mean, you've been doing it for so long at this point, it probably comes natural to you in your creative process. But like, how do you do that when you're watching something? Like, I don't know, like when you're watching the certain episodes, are you like timestamping where these moments are, where you're like, we have to include this in here, and then you just come back to them later, and then you're just trimming them out? Is that essentially kind of how it works?
Yeah. So essentially, how do I pull my selects? Is that
yeah. Like, how do you look at that? Like, because there's so much there, especially if you're watching, an hour-long thing or a 30-minute thing. You got to be sitting there like taking notes, right?
Yeah. Well, there's in the Avid, there's actually called a marker key.
Oh, gotcha.
So I'll sit there, and they're color coded. But generally, I'll just have my finger on that key on the keyboard, and as I'm watching it and I see something, I just tap the marker, and I know when I'll watch it through. I won't pull selects as I'm watching it. I'll watch it through, and I'll just hit those markers, and then I'll go back and then I'll go back to that marker. And why did I hit that marker? Oh, there's a dialogue on there, and I'll just pull that, and I'll pull that clip, and I'll add it to my select spin that we had talked about earlier. And then this is a cool fight scene. I'll pull that. This is a really cool head turn from Ahsoka. I'll pull that, that kind of a thing. So
yeah. So you're watching it with such a different kind of creative eye, I suppose, while you're like different from how everyone else is watching this stuff for the first time, because you're trying to find the best moments, and then you go back later and like, what was I thinking? Was that actually good? Was that actually a good thing, or was I just like, clicking it because I thought maybe it would be something we could use? But then I'm sure you also need to do, there's like B-roll and stuff as well that you're gonna have to cut out as well. So there's like, I guess there's so many different elements you're focusing on while you're watching that, which is just such an interesting component to me, because you're not able to really watch it like everyone else is going to be in a way, right? You're watching with a creative eye the whole time.
Right, but I still enjoy the story, and I'm really sort of also trying to find the story.
Right.
Either whether I've just been given the free reign to do what I want to do, or the stakeholders and the filmmakers, the show makers have given me, we want to sort of focus on this arc, and I'll be listening overall to things, but in particular, I'll try and pull things that relate to that.
Right.
And my dialogue bin essentially could have almost all of the dialogue from the show, but if I feel like I want to have a dialogue line from Zeb, I can just search Zeb, and all the Zeb dialogue comes up, and he says Carabas.
Oh, wow.
I'm like, perfect. That's a great reaction. And I'll just
there it is.
Oh, wow. That's interesting.
Kevin, as you're talking about this too, as you're saying this, the first thing that popped in my head was the Rebels season 3 trailer. The one where it opens.
The mid-season trailer?
The one where it's like you kind of find it like he's looking at the holocron.
Yeah.
And you can tell, and then it's like Kanan's like, oh, it's changing him. Mm-hmm. Did you do that one?
Yeah.
See, that's what I thought.
There's only one Rebels trailer that I did not do, and that was one of the first ones in season 1. I can't recall.
Oh, okay.
I don't recall because what we call them internally and what they eventually get called externally sometimes are quite different.
Oh, okay.
Because marketing may have a plan of how they want to present it, right? Whereas I'm just calling it Rebel Season 1 trailer.
Yeah.
Trailer 1 version, right? It's really
version 2.8. Yeah.
Right. No one wants to see that on their YouTube thing, right? Yeah. So so one of the early ones for Rebels was done in Burbank by Disney, and then I was able to do pretty much all the other ones. Yeah.
That's super interesting. I'm curious, like, again, the creative side of things, like I make music, like I said. It's kind of ruined music for me in a way, because there's certain songs I listen to now where I'm like, I'm just trying to, you've seen how the sausage is made, so you're trying to understand, oh, they use this sound here and they use this here, that's cool, and you're constantly thinking in that editing production type of way. Do you do that at all? Like when you see a trailer on TV, or you're on YouTube or whatever, and you're going through, do you look at it and are you critical of it, or like how does that, I guess, come off to you
a little bit
looking at it?
But it's a little bit, and I think it was more so in the early moments of the internet, when trailers were getting posted, and before that, to sort of side tangent, the trailer houses used to subscribe to this service where they would get VHS tapes sent to them every month, and it would have all of the trailers that had been released that month. So you would get this tape and you could put it in and watch, and it would have a list and you'd watch it.
Wow.
And then as download speeds became more efficient and codecs for compressing video got more efficient, it was easier to stream things online and post things online. But yeah, I mean, I think really early on, you would hear a lot of the same music tracks and sometimes the same sound effects. And I would say this going back to the 90s and maybe even the early 2000s, because the amount of companies specifically making music for theatrical marketing and trailers was really small. And so you relied on soundtracks of previous movies and the small pool of music made by maybe 2 or 3 or 4 companies that were doing stuff that was of theatrical quality. There was lots of music libraries out there, but it sounded like some guy on their Casio 6500,
Yeah.
they just weren't going to work for playing in a theater. So at that point, the really good stuff was used, and maybe there was, I'm oversimplifying this, but let's just say there's 12 awesome action cues between all of these libraries, but between all the movies that are made in the next couple of years, there's a lot of action movies. So maybe you hear a cue that was used in one marketing campaign for a movie, maybe a year later you hear it again. There's one cue in particular for this movie called Hoffa that was used so much that there's an award ceremony. There's a couple award ceremonies now for trailers and theatrical marketing, but the main one years ago was the Key Art Awards run by the Hollywood Reporter. And the folks that were sort of putting that show together made a funny video, and they basically put a moratorium, like no one is allowed to use this. They basically retired that cue and said no one is allowed to use that cue anymore. Because it was one of those cues that sort of had this mix of heavy drama and sort of, it had a beat, it had a driving beat, but it conveyed heavy drama and things like that. So anytime there was a movie of that, they're like, let's use the Hoffa cue. And basically, and it was such a perfect cue that it got used to death, and no one in their right mind will use it.
That's
and if
so
you hear it now, it's only in parody.
That's such an interesting, because I there are things like I notice in movies or trailers, there are certain like the sound effects and stuff that we know that you hear in every movie. Like there's the camel noise, the horse noise is one.
Right.
Like,
The Wilhelm scream.
The Wilhelm scream, obviously, but then like a gate opening, like a creaky gate, you hear it in all these same things over and over again.
Car peel outs drive me nuts.
Yeah. And once you hear it, you can't unhear it. Once you know that it's constantly used, and you'll hear it, and you're like, they're using that same horse
sound
neigh.
idea. ED72 track 45. I've heard that so many times.
Yeah, that's got to drive you nuts. I'm sure you watch some of these things, and you're like, oh my God, come on, guys, let's innovate here more.
To that point, the amount of people that affects is this big, and the amount of people that have no clue is quite large. So,
right, but I mean, I'm sure you're probably still sitting there as a new trailer comes on TV, and do you ever look at it like, I wouldn't have done that, or like, I would have done, maybe this a little differently? Are you able to just enjoy a trailer for what it is?
I do that more with work that I've done.
Right.
Yeah. I'll look at it, and times I'll wince. I'm like, what was I thinking? And why did I do that? Or why did that music change? I should have smoothed that out, or why did I do this? Or why is it so, I should have been more efficient, things like that. I'll do that. But with other folks' stuff, I just try to enjoy it. And a lot of times if I see a movie and I'll look at it and go, man, that's a really complex movie, or a really interesting plot line. I wonder how they marketed that. And then I'll go and search out the trailer, and I'll look at it and go, okay, that's how they did that. And that's how because it's in the theatrical marketing world, you're sort of trying to solve this, I don't want to call it a problem, but you're sort of trying to crack the code of what's going to market this movie the best.
Yeah.
And so it's a combination of finding those story elements and presenting those in a really interesting and compelling way. And sometimes movies that are really complicated, that are really good, they just don't lend themselves to sort of a trailer. So maybe the trailer is sort of done in a very avant-garde way, or very, very overly simple way. So movies that I know that are complicated, I'll go back and try and look at that. But in terms, I'm sorry, go ahead, Matt.
Well, I kind of going back to what you were saying right now, because that's a really interesting thing you just said. When it comes to like the theatrical trailers and whatnot, like, do you have like 3 rules or like 3 elements, or what are the top 3 elements to like a good trailer in your opinion? Or is like are there guidelines that you follow? Like, is there like a process that you have where you're like, I have to hit these main things while I'm creating this?
Stylistically or narratively?
I guess kind of both. I guess more narratively. I mean, unless Melissa, you have a different idea there.
No, I mean, because like trailers are done in a lot of different styles. You know, there's definitely so there's like a different touch to each one depending on what you're going for, and I feel like that can directly correlate with the narrative.
Yeah, and there's sometimes you'll see a trailer as well, and like this annoys me personally when you see a trailer that just gives away everything, and you're like, I kind of feel like I've seen it all now. Like it doesn't leave me wanting as much as I could. You know what I mean? So like, is there a process that you have where you're like, I gotta hit, like I don't know, I guess like a checklist that you have, or like
yes and no, but I think that comes from when I pull selects. I'll hear a dialogue line. I go, that has to go in. That's a really great line. Or there's a great moment or an interaction. I really want to work that in somehow. And maybe it's a moment where I know I can shift gears in the trailer and kind of go in a different direction, sort of stop down the trailer and go in a different direction. Or maybe it's something where I know I want to start it or end it. Or maybe it's just a really cool shot that I, like Ahsoka with the explosion behind her, that I want to put in a montage. But I think to that point, Matt, I think if you look at trailers, many of them have a very basic structure. Maybe they're 3 acts or maybe 4 acts. And you kind of have, in a very oversimplified sense, you have sort of the hook, then you have the story, the conflict, and the resolution, in a really overly simplified way. Now that's where you can start from thinking, but I think there's a lot of really good trailers that deviate from that may present it in a completely new way, in a very different way. And that's what makes those great too. But how those elements are brought together and presented can be done very differently. So with the Bad Batch trailer, sort of the hook was, we're going to flash back and sort of, recap what happened before. And that's partially done to also educate folks that may not have seen season 1. So they kind of catch them back up to speed, or people that have seen it maybe sort of have forgotten a little bit. And then we kind of go off and create what we do. So there's, I'm trying to think of trailers that have really sort of gone outside the norm. Girl with the Dragon Tattoo is one. I mean, if you're awesome. If you're familiar with the subject matter of that movie, it's difficult. How do you sell that to the general public? It's a dark movie, right?
Yeah, and they did the 9 Inch Nails remix of Led Zeppelin. Right. They have just the flashing coming in. Very cool trailer, actually.
And they just straight up told you that the movie that's, I can't remember exactly what it was, like the feel bad movie of the season.
Yeah.
Right. I think it was, there's that. And then going way back, the trailer for the movie Amadeus.
Oh yeah. Back in the, what was that, the late 80s, early 90s?
Amadeus is mid 80s.
But that was also that just reminds me of, the trailers from when I was growing up, where the narration over them was such a big, that was such a big thing. That in a world, which is hilarious to watch them now, because
there's one thing they didn't count on.
Yeah, and they're hilarious to watch now, because it was so normal back then. Now we look back on them and we're like, well, that's ridiculous. Just show me, what it's gonna be like. But I'm sure there'll also be some things we look back on now, where in the styles that are current today, and we'll be like, why did we do it that way? But it's
but there's again, I look at stuff that I did years ago, and I just wince sometimes.
Yeah, well, it's hard. I mean, as a creative person, we all do that same thing. You look at any of your previous work, whether it's writing or art or music or video editing, you're going to look back on what you did before, because you've progressed, obviously, since that time where you were making that particular content, and you're gonna cringe a little bit because you think differently now. You've evolved as a person, and you're
learning, and I think it's important, no matter what element or what stage of your career is, if you can learn something new on a regular basis, that's great. And I may be a bit older than other trailer editors, but that doesn't mean I can't learn from them, or learn from people that are new to this field. And as technology evolves, you're learning new ways to do things and new ways to tackle problems, especially with the music. Having the multiple tracks of music and then actually having composers isolating those tracks and stems so that, and making them available to people, that has really opened up the doors. And then having people do custom music and writing custom music or scoring custom music for trailers, that happens too. So you get interesting takes on songs that you may be familiar with.
Yeah.
Or there's a track that has an overlay. I know in some of the Star Wars theatrical marketing, they're overlaying Star Wars themes into existing cues, and vice versa. Yeah. They take a little bit of a drum beat or something and then overlay that into an existing cue.
Yeah. That's a big thing right now, isn't it? The taking the stems of a popular song from 20 years ago and then having it, a custom mix for that specific trailer. It's an interesting trend. Are there any other like trends that you've noticed with movie or television trailers that maybe are annoying to you, or maybe you look at them and you're like, that's a cool direction?
Yeah.
Right.
Is there anything like that
recently or just over the years?
Either. I mean, recently would be interesting because that's one that I've noticed recently. But and obviously, like we were just talking about the in a world narration stuff. But yeah, I guess either one. Like whichever. Have there been trends, or are there current trends that you're seeing that you look at and you're like, oh, that's interesting, or hey, that's annoying to me?
I think recently a trend that I actually really like is sort of the deconstruction of cues and being able to sort of pull them apart and use elements of a cue and create a new cue, if you will. And then sometimes I'll hear music, the most recent Mandalorian season 3 trailer with the voices in there, and I love that. I don't know, and I don't know if that's to me, I listen to that and I think, okay, is that something that they specifically scored for that, or is that part of a cue and they're ducking all these other elements and they're just emphasizing those voices? I want to know. So that's fun. Yeah. Recently, I don't know if there's a trend that is annoying. I think a lot of the stuff that's being done is really cool and innovative and fun to watch. In the past, a lot of the innovations were sort of related to what the avid media composer or what Final Cut Pro or Premiere could do that they couldn't do before. More audio tracks, more video tracks.
Yeah.
At one point years ago, the Avid had this. The Avid Media Composer has a few picture altering capabilities. It's not a color finishing tool that you might find in Premiere or some of the other tools, but early Media Composer had something that was called Solarize, and I'm trying to think of a trailer that used it, but basically it was a white flash. So you had a white flash, so editors would cut to 1 or 2 frames of white and then dissolve to the next shot. So it was typically on a music hit or sound effects, and it would be this white flash and it would go. And I think Basic Instinct, it was one of those trailers. There was a trailer with Anthony Hopkins and Cuba Gooding Jr., and I can't remember it, that did that a lot. And so the next step from the white flash was this Solarize. So you would cut to a few frames of a frame that was solarized. So if the shot was me, you'd see me solarized. It would be white with a really high contrast sort of outline of my face, and then they dissolve to the normal thing. So that. Oh
yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about.
So those two things, that like the white flash went to the solarize, and then the solarize, then that got played out, and then I
remember that. I remember those those trends as well. It's funny to think back on it because you can kind of. I bet you could probably do this better than anyone else, but pick out, if I showed you a trailer and you hadn't seen it before, you could probably tell when it was made based on just how it looks. Because obviously the first movie trailers, I mean, years and years, decades ago, those are interesting to watch too, but you can kind of see the progression from the very beginning to now. Like even if looking at the first Star Wars A New Hope trailer is really interesting to watch, because you look at it and you're like, it's hard, especially for the younger generation. You know, like Melissa or I, we see something like that, a trailer from the '70s, and it's just hard to comprehend that was a real thing.
Right. Well, oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, it's funny because I rewatched that yesterday because I was like, you know what? I'm interested. Like, I haven't seen, like, because I've seen the trailers before, but I went back and I watched them. And it's just because you have that narration over it. Yeah. Like, trying to build hype, and then they'll have, like, these randomized shots of Darth Vader or Princess Leia or the droids walking through the desert with no real narrative to the trailer. It's like a bunch of just random cuts from the film. And it's just like trying to entice, like, ooh, come see, this is cool, but it's not necessarily telling a story per se.
I think that directly ties into the fact that so many of the shots weren't done.
Yeah.
I think if not to plug the ILM special on Disney Plus, if you watch that, a lot of that will be explained. They didn't finish shots until days before that movie came out. And they were still working on shots. So the marketing team said, well, we got none of the special effects except for these 2 shots. How do we're going to do this? And you look at the lightsabers, and the lightsabers aren't done, and all that kind of stuff. So I can feel their pain of the marketing team.
Yeah, for sure.
Definitely.
Is that something you run into often? Like unfinished shots, like stuff that you would want to incorporate that maybe you can't?
Yeah, with the animation stuff, that happened a lot. You would get whatever episodes were finished, and then some that were not 100% finished to work on, and you'd pull from there. And then maybe you would get a couple shots, random shots from other episodes even farther down the line that were going to be ready, because the way they did the show wasn't necessarily in a linear order of how the shots are in the show. They would sort of tackle various problems and then assemble the show. So there were plenty of times where we would want to use a shot and production would just say, we can't get this done. You're going to have to find an alternate.
Yeah.
Or sometimes we were lucky enough to sort of pull a meeting together, and everyone would sort of put their heads together and try and figure out a solve. Maybe it would be a situation where not all of the elements are going to be added to the shot so that they can finish it in time. I know for the Clone Wars Chicago trailer, the shot where Ahsoka is holding onto the Mandalorian and she's flying.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
If you compare that to the final shot, it's not 100% the same. There's elements missing from the trailer shot. So, but it's you know, for the 2 seconds or 2.5 seconds you see it, you know, it works fine. It's not unfinished. It's just not
it's not the final thing. They did.
Right.
There was some other stuff that was added. Yeah.
Right.
And I think we talked about how in War of the Worlds, you know, the same thing where shots get fast tracked for the trailer or for marketing, but they're not exactly how they end up in the feature release or the show release.
Right.
And that happens a lot.
Wow. So, Kevin, I do have to ask you, so for somebody, because I have a couple friends that are interested in video editing, and I got to be honest, with like doing this podcast, it's really forced me to kind of consider like the way that like I do it, even though it's not something like doing a trailer, but it does kind of change my perspective in the way that I'm thinking about it. But I'm curious as to what advice you would give somebody who's kind of looking to pursue this seriously. I mean, like, to get where you've been, because it's a really, what's the word I'm looking for? Specific career path you're in. And I'm just like curious what some advice that you would give to somebody who's trying to get your job. You know,
someone who wants to get into theatrical trailer editing. Wow. I think nowadays they have an advantage where they do have Final Cut Pro and they do have Premiere and they do have consumer level versions of Media Composer, or there's a handful of other editing softwares out there. But when I started out, I had to basically learn on the job. But I think if you want to get involved in theatrical trailer editing, you have to be in Southern California. There's a place in New York that does it, and I know there's a couple places maybe in England that do it, but the vast majority of places are in Southern California and sort of hubbed around the studios. Some will be in West LA, some will be in Hollywood, some will be in the San Fernando Valley, all over the place. But basically, they're within a stone's throw, if you will, of Hollywood and the studios. But with fast internet and folks working from home, I think probably the door is pretty open in terms of that. I would say if you don't have a reel, look at how trailers are constructed. Just keep creating content. And I don't know them specifically, but I know of people that have cut really cool reels and things of that nature and posted them to YouTube. And one or two people have gotten jobs working in theatrical marketing and working on trailers. I think that's very few, but it has happened. Mm-hmm. I think if you're young and you don't really know really where to go and you just kind of want to learn how to do it, one sort of trick that we would do when I wasn't at Lucasfilm and I was at another facility, and we would have a young person coming in, they want to do editing and they understood how to edit, but they were trying to learn how things were constructed, because we talked about there's sort of a way things are constructed. And if you watch a trailer or a TV spot, there's never really any dead space. There's always something happening. And if there's dead space, it's there for a reason. It's there for some sort of dramatic storytelling reason or to sort of reset. But there's never a line of dialogue, sort of a pause, and then a reply dialogue. So it's always sort of something happening, whether it's a sound effect, a music, or a dialogue line, or something like that. So if you watch theatrical marketing, whether it's a TV spot or a trailer, there's always something going on. So what we would do is we would take a trailer or a TV spot and take away all the picture, but leave the audio, and then just tell the person that was trying to sort of learn the craft, now just cut picture to this using audio. What picture would you cut? And don't look at what was done before. And so that would sort of train them to sort of figure out what to do. And then once they sort of get the idea, I mean, there's multiple ways to do it, but this is just one of the things that we did. And sometimes it's just trial and error. You get in there and you try something and you see if it works. For me, I started cutting 15-second TV spots, and those are really, really quick. Mm-hmm. And at the time, they had a little bit of narration, so you kind of really knew exactly what to do. And so you're in and out. So in a TV spot, typically, at least at the time when I was first starting out, you have a little bit of time for the logo of the movie. And then at the very end, you have the title and the tag. And the tag is starts Friday, now playing, whatever that sort of call to action would be. So you knew you had to leave some space for the narrator to say, starts Friday at a theater near you. And so you realize in a 15-second spot, maybe you have 10 seconds or 11 seconds of actual stuff that you need to cut. And if there's narration involved, you really sort of had it spelled out. And then once I was doing that and selling those and having the clients, buy those, if you will, then they sort of graduated me to 30-second spots. And then once I was able to once I was consistently selling or getting the client to sign off and on the TV spot, then they would throw me sort of a low-level trailer. And then I would cut a low-level trailer for whether it was a direct-to-video or for a convention of sorts in the theatrical world that was sort of not on the radar of the big movies. And that you sort of have to prove that you could do it, and then run up. And then when I left that first job, when I worked my way up and I went to this other place, it was a much smaller place, and we did tons of stuff for direct. We had one client that was this sort of low rent, straight to video stuff. And it was cutting, we would get 2 weeks to cut and finish a trailer. And they would come to us. There's excuse me as I jump off on this tangent. Sort of like in Santa Monica, there's forget the name of it, but basically there was sort of a convention at one of the hotels, and all of this sort of low rent, straight to video movies would come and sort of sell their wares. So I'm making a movie. It's not the Titanic, it's called the Britannic, and it's about this, basically either movie ripoffs or I don't know if you ever heard of the Trauma films with the Toxic Avenger, all these sort of low rent, sort of straight to videos, movies. That's where they would go, and people would buy and sell and get some sort of distribution deal. And we had this one client that was in that world, and they would come to us every year and give us a stack of movies and go, we just need these done by, this would be February, and we need these done by November. So in between jobs that were really cool, we would get these churn 'em and burn 'ems, and a lot of times they were just these horrible action movies, and you just try and figure out, well, how can I make this movie look interesting and get in and out of it in 60 to 90 seconds. And other times they would give you a movie and like, oh, this movie reminds us of this, and we want it to be like, make it like Gone in 60 Seconds. So you'd go, okay. And you'd watch Gone in 60 Seconds about a dozen times, just sort of dissect what they're doing. And then you would look at this movie and you'd kind of emulate that. And they were tickled pink, and, there you go. So that sort of got me to sort of learn how to do things, doing a lot of stuff for movies that I wouldn't recommend to anybody. But that's how I sort of learned to do what I do. And then the times that really cool stuff comes along, you can, hopefully do something really good and go from there. And I don't know if that's a solid path to doing what I do, but that's kind of what I did in terms of trying to learn how to do what I do.
Right.
There's a lot of different paths you can take. Every path for somebody is different, especially in a creative field like this. It seems like today, at least with YouTube, that's a huge leg up that a lot of people have, where you can get creative with the different things that you make, and you can just put them out there in the world. And if it's good enough, it's going to get noticed at some point or another. And you have to put yourself out there and just be in the industry is what it sounds like. For you, it's obviously a very different time. You had to get out there and cut your teeth on these straight to video movies, but it was a great experience for you because you got to churn out a lot of different trailers, and so you get that experience doing that. And today it's an ever evolving environment where there's different ways to do things. You can obviously they're not cutting things analog. You have Final Cut Pro, Premiere, Avid, all these different softwares to use where anyone can do it. Even iMovie is how you could get started. It's a free thing if you buy your Mac. So the barrier to entry is much less than it was
for sure
20, 30 years ago.
For sure. That's what I should have said. Thank you, Matt. You should host the podcast.
So, Kevin, before we close this out, I have to ask you two important questions.
Okay.
Who's your favorite Star Wars character that you were biased towards? And what are you most looking forward to in the upcoming slate of Star Wars projects?
The first one's a tricky question because I think for me it's changed over the years. What was my favorite when I was younger is not my favorite now. My favorite now is Ahsoka, hands down.
Good choice. Good answer. Oh, there it is, Fulcrum.
So, and what I'm most looking forward to, obviously, is the Ahsoka show. But short term, what I'm looking forward to in the next few days is Andor. And I'm really, really excited for that.
Especially the trailer for that. That's another thing Melissa and I just did reactions to. We do reactions for all the new trailers. And that one was one that they did such a good job, I think, without giving too much away of what the show is, of just showing little bits and showing, I guess, the tone of what the show is going to be. And that's what got me so excited. If you would have just told me a year ago that show's coming out, it doesn't have the same impact as when you see that trailer. You know what I mean? Because, again, like what we're talking about earlier, what Melissa said is like it does kind of set people's expectations. I'm super stoked for that one as well.
Yeah.
I just think this one's going to be able to do things that some of these other shows haven't been able to do.
Yeah.
So I'm super, super excited for that. Also, Ahsoka's going to be amazing. And Bad Batch is going to be great too.
I'm most looking forward to, I have to be honest though, I'm most looking forward to Tales of the Jedi, Ahsoka, and Bad Batch.
Yeah.
I'm so excited.
I will say I'm right there with you. I do have a love and affinity for the animation. It's just great. A lot of folks out there feel the same way. But and to your point, Matt, we're talking about Rogue One being sort of this open playground because you have characters that really have no boundaries preset, and you can kind of do whatever you want to do. That's what was great about Rebels. You had this group of people that you really enjoyed watching, and then you grew to enjoy watching, and every once in a while a character would drop in that you knew, but you really kind of didn't know what was going to happen with these folks. You kind of speculated, well, I don't see this person here, so something must happen. Maybe something doesn't happen. But the way that sort of played out, and especially when Kanan's on top of the exploding fuel depot, and like his eyes go from gray back to his normal color because he can finally see, if you will, like
yeah,
you know, like
yeah.
Kevin, you didn't have to bring that up.
Sorry.
That's like the top 10 moments I'm never going to get over in Star Wars.
Yeah,
I can't watch that without crying.
There's been a lot of good. There's been a lot of good. As I said, us Star Wars fans are eating good. There's so much. There's been so much amazing stuff lately, and it makes me happy. Just looking at, when Phantom Menace came out, the first Star Wars movie to come out in my lifetime, and the hype that was behind that, to now, and the amount of stuff that we have now, it's incredible. And I've always thought, like, all these shows are starting to get announced and everything. It made me so excited because I'm like, it's such a cool world. And now we can explore it with all these different ideas, with Rebels, with Andor, with Mandalorian, which is really what kicked that all off, which I also love that show. And it's only going to get better from here on out because it is such an interesting world. So to be able to see these original stories that we can get with this, and I do like the main characters and stuff too, like Kenobi, obviously great. Talk about iconic moments. The last episode of Kenobi, unbelievable.
Right.
But these original stories, I think, is what I'm most excited for, because there's no pressure on the writers to you don't have to appease anybody. You don't have to do right by any of these characters or fulfill someone's expectations of what people think these characters are supposed to be. And you can build out these totally new, organic characters that have their own paths and have their own journeys. And that's what makes me so stoked, because we have no shortage of content coming out anytime soon.
It'll be good. Well, Kevin, thank you so much for giving us your time and coming on this show. I know that you have an incredibly busy schedule. I mean, there's a surplus of projects, as we just talked about right now.
Right.
But gosh, we really appreciate your time, and I don't know about you, I'm so excited to see what else you do, what other trailers and feels you give us with those. So I'm looking forward to it.
Right. Much appreciated. And this was a lot of fun, and I always enjoy sort of talking nerdy Star Wars stuff, and anytime.
Yeah, we'd love to have you back on sometime for sure.
Definitely.
Cool. Well,
thanks so much.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thanks so much. Have a great rest of the day, and I guess we'll talk later.
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks so much, Kevin. Really appreciate it.
Cool. And hopefully there's a person out there that becomes a trailer editor and teaches me a thing or two sometime.
Woo!
Hopefully. We'll leave it on that note. Thanks, Kevin. And thanks, everyone, for joining us. We'll see you soon.
Bye-bye.